This event is all about the Fashion Revolution Manifesto, and that is a sort of 10-point document which is a pledge to what kind of fashion industry we want to imagine, a sort of utopia of fashion. And I think that's particularly relevant just now for the coronavirus crisis that we're in. We all have a little bit more time to reflect on what kind of fashion industry we want to see in the future. So I'm just going to share my screen now. I hope everyone can hear me okay, but do put in the chat if you have any problems. So hopefully you can all see what's going on here. All right, so I'm going to start my presentation now, if that's all right. Again, we're going to go through the points of the manifesto, but I'm just also going to introduce a little bit about what Fashion Revolution Week is all about and why this is all relevant for the time we're all living through now, the coronavirus crisis. So first, I'm just going to introduce myself. So this is me. My name is Ruth MacGilp, and I live in Edinburgh, and I volunteer for Fashion Revolution Scotland, which is the sort of local team for Fashion Revolution. In usual circumstances, you know, we host events throughout the community, so things like film screenings and panel discussions and things like that. But right now we've digitized everything, which has really been an amazing kind of insight into what kind of reach we can have. So it's been an exciting time for us. In terms of my sort of day job, I'm a digital marketer and I write about all things sort of ethical fashion. So I do copywriting for ethical brands, and I also write on my own blog and for other people as well. All about kind of secondhand style, affordable and accessible alternatives to fast fashion. And of course, mobilizing people to be kind of citizen activists at home too. So first up, what is Fashion Revolution? So Fashion Revolution is a global movement that's trying to build a better fashion industry, and it compiles everyone from us as consumers and citizens to designers, brands, retailers, activists, educators and students. It's basically a rallying cry for all of us to come together and campaign for a better fashion industry. There's now teams in over 70 countries, which is really amazing. It started kind of small in London, and now it's all over the world. And the momentum, if you just have a look online at the hashtags and things, it's sort of mind-blowing. And Fashion Revolution started in 2013, and it was a sort of response in the wake of the Rana disaster, which was a factory collapse in Bangladesh in 2013 on the 24th of April. Well over 1,000 garment workers died, and this was a sort of a response from change makers in the industry to say, this can't happen again. We need to come together to ensure that this doesn't happen again. So every year, that anniversary on the 24th of April is sort of Fashion Revolution Day, and the week surrounding it is all about encouraging brand transparency. And the reason for this is that in the Rana Plaza disaster, brands sort of refused to take accountability for producing in that factory. And that's because there was no paper trail, and the supply chains were so complex that they couldn't be traced back to that factory. And this lack of transparency leads to this lack of accountability, which obviously just has a huge knock-on effect. So Fashion Revolution Week surrounds this idea of increasing transparency. They have a huge program of events each year, and obviously this year it's online, which has been a sort of an eye-opening experience to see how we can access new audiences, not just the sort of fashion bubble, but how can we reach everyone to get involved. Oops, sorry. So the central question of Fashion Revolution Week is, who made my clothes? And again, this comes back to this idea of a paper trail. How can we count on our brands to make the right decisions if even they don't know what's going on in their supply chain? Fashion is really opaque. It's not an industry that loves to share the details of how they operate. And unfortunately, the garment workers are often the ones at the forefront of this and bearing the brunt of this. It's an unregulated industry. We've been talking about this idea a lot, that, you know, unlike food or other industries, it's completely unregulated. And brands can sort of operate with their complex supply chains, outsourcing all over the world, the consequences of which they almost don't have to face because they can say, oh, that's not our problem. The idea of Who Made My Clothes is that increased transparency leads to increased accountability, which hopefully leads to change. And if we can't see it, we can't fix it. So it's sort of that first step. Again, obviously transparency isn't everything. The Fashion Revolution Transparency Index just came out, and it ranks brands on how much they disclose about their production and what they make their clothes from. But it doesn't mean that they're sustainable. It just means that they're telling us that they are. So it's not everything, but it's that first step towards, you know, building a fashion industry where we as consumers have the right to know what's going on behind closed doors. So this hashtag Who Made My Clothes, sort of Fashion Revolution encourage everyone around the world to share this hashtag, you know, holding a sign or holding out the label of their clothes to really make brands take notice on social media, and also via emails and things like that. They've got lots of templates. So it's really about using your right as a consumer to demand better from the brands that you invest your hard-earned cash in. Another hashtag that Fashion Revolution are pushing this year is What's in My Clothes. So again, this is all about materials and composition, which is one of the key themes this year. And this idea is basically centered around that polyester, 60% of our clothes are made from polyester now. That stat has doubled since the year 2000. And what most people don't know who aren't in the fashion industry is that polyester is plastic. And I think there's this sort of disconnect between like maybe a plastic bag or a straw or something that's more obvious, where we're like, oh, I don't use single-use plastics anymore. But we forget that polyester is plastic and we are wearing plastics, you know? So this idea of what's in my clothes, it's not just about asking brands to tell us more about the fabrics. It's about sort of auditing our own wardrobes and thinking how much of my wardrobe is actually made from synthetic materials, made from oil. So Carrie Summers, who is one of the co-founders of Fashion Revolution, went on an expedition around the Galapagos Islands to sort of investigate the impact that synthetic fibers have been having. So this is basically microplastics and microfibers, because when we wear synthetic clothing and we wash it, it releases microscopic fibers. And really, as sort of the scientific community don't even know yet, you know, the impact that this is having. So yeah, this question of what's in my clothes, it's really important that we as consumers kind of have a curiosity about what we're wearing and what we're actually putting on our skin. You know, just like the food that we eat, we want to know the ingredients of that and maybe the nutritional information, but maybe we don't have that same level of care when it comes to what we put on our skin. And yeah, this is the goal of this idea of what's in my clothes, is hopefully to incentivize businesses to move towards more sustainable materials, be it natural materials or more innovative solutions. So that's the idea of these two questions. Now, moving on to sort of the impact that coronavirus is having right now on the people that make our clothes. I've just put a couple of news stories here, but if you've been kind of following the sort of fashion press recently, you will have seen hundreds of stories about garment workers and the fashion industry as a whole, and how coronavirus is impacting those sort of people that are often forgotten in the fashion value chain. So the first thing to flag is this idea of cancellation of orders. So here we've got a stat that £2.4 billion of orders in Bangladesh have been cancelled, and that's from sort of major fast fashion brands. The reason this is a problem is because brands don't pay in advance for a massive order of clothing. They are paid on completion. So these factories have already invested their time, their resources, their workers, their materials in producing these massive orders of hundreds of thousands of products. And then brands are just saying, no, I'm not going to pay for that because nobody's shopping anymore because we're all in lockdown. And it sort of created this huge knock-on effect where over 1 million garment workers have lost their jobs. According to the Centre for Global Workers' Rights, 80% of those garment workers have been sent home without any severance pay or furlough pay. So it's not like, oh, I've just been put on furlough. It's you've lost your job. You have no source of income. There's no insurance there. So obviously this is a huge knock-on effect, and we can hear from garment workers and garment factory owners directly, where they're saying, I'm not sure I'll survive. You know, they have no support from the brands that rely on them. So we're sort of encouraging brands right now to really pay up for these cancelled orders. It's basically the least they can do, to be honest with you, to pay for what they've already put in place. It's sort of a mind-blowing idea that they're refusing to do that, but this campaign to get them to pay up is something that I've been trying to get involved with myself. There's this hashtag pay up, and there's a big petition going on, and this sort of consumer action really has made a difference too, with brands such as Primark releasing funds for garment workers and things like that. So this is obviously all a bit doom and gloom, but there's sort of actions that come from this too. I just want to talk very, very briefly too about the environmental side as well as the social side. So we're all obviously sitting at home. We're not really shopping unless we're shopping online, and we're sort of wearing what we have because we don't have a fancy occasion to wear clothes from. A lot of us are learning to mend and make. Like today I've been looking at sewing machines and everything's sold out. It's sort of what all the ethical fashion people have wanted all along. Let's all just slow down and stop shopping, which obviously could be a positive for the planet. But obviously it has this knock-on effect for garment workers losing work, and brands as well in this state of emergency, in this sort of force majeure, like they aren't seeing sustainability as the priority now. So all these like commitments and pledges and petitions and accords that they've signed and put into place, they're sort of saying, you know, that's not our priority now. We're in crisis mode. And this amazing article by Claire Press in the Business of Fashion sort of summarized why that is such a long-term sort of dangerous impact, that even in this time of crisis, it shouldn't be a sort of optional extra to invest in sustainability. It's a real long-term cost. And unfortunately, with the coronavirus crisis, it doesn't mean the climate crisis has stopped. So it's sort of really important that we don't forget that the environmental problems are still there. And yeah, I mean, even just a personal anecdote, that I feel that while a lot of people are like investing in sort of learning to mend and repair, there are others who maybe with the lack of resources available, like charity shops and recycling facilities, just are disposing of their clothes irresponsibly. Like I went to take my bins out, and in my general waste bin, it was basically full to the brim with clothing, like someone had a closet clear out and just dumped it there. So there's a real disconnect, I think, in terms of education and what's the right thing to do right now. So moving on from that, what can we do to fix all of these really mind-blowing and huge problems? What's vital right now for me is that we focus on the changes that need to be made to the fashion industry, like right now, to ensure that when we do emerge from this crisis, that we don't just return to business as usual. We don't just go right back 3 steps to where we were before. How can we make changes now and fast to make sure that after coronavirus, there is a new normal? So what kind of world do we want to see emerge? What kind of fashion industry do we want to see? And this manifesto that I'm going to show you now sort of lays out an idea of what this new normal could look like. And it's a real kind of utopian vision, but it's something that's achievable when we rally together as an industry. So I just want to go through it now. And if you have any thoughts on each point in the manifesto, I'd love to hear them as well. So step 1 of the manifesto for a fashion revolution is this: fashion provides dignified work from conception to creation to catwalk. It does not enslave, endanger, exploit, overwork, harass, abuse, or discriminate against anyone. Fashion liberates worker and wearer and empowers everyone to stand up for their rights. So this really sets out the tone of the rest of the manifesto, that we don't want any form of exploitation at all. This isn't about reducing our negative impact on people in the supply chain. It's really about creating a new industry where nobody is exploited. And it's not just garment workers, it's everyone, including us as the wearer, including our own rights as a consumer, and for us to not be exploited by the fashion system as well. And also, I mean, retail workers, when we're sort of linking it back to coronavirus, sort of retail assistants in stores were kind of forced to go to work right up till we were forced by the government to go into lockdown. You know, brands were not protecting their workers on the front lines from coronavirus. And how can we move towards this utopia? Again, it's about campaigning brands. It's about signing these petitions to pay up. It's about lobbying our governments to get that fixing fashion report back on the agenda. And it's about really, really believing that this dream of fashion that is joyful, that is creative, that at its core is something to celebrate, can exist. We want all the good points of fashion. We want it to be expressive and creative, but we don't want the exploitation. And I really think when we read this first point in the manifesto, is it really that radical that we want clothing without exploitation? It's really it should be a basic right. So that's kind of sets the tone. So this is the second point in the manifesto. Fashion provides fair and equal pay. It enriches the livelihood of everyone working across the industry, from farm to shop floor. Fashion lifts people out of poverty, creates thriving societies, and fulfills aspiration. So the global fashion industry has a net worth right now of $2.4 trillion, and it employs over 300 million people. So there's no doubt in our minds that fashion is a really successful and profitable industry. It's not struggling on that front, but this financial success that fashion has is shared by such small proportion of people. It's shared by a really select few, the executives, the CEOs, the creative directors and the board members and the investors. But this is a really labor intensive industry that, you know, fashion isn't very futuristic where things are made by robots. It's really just pairs of hands. It's 300 million pairs of hands that drive this industry and that create this value. But all of the people behind those pairs of hands aren't getting any of that financial success. They're getting this tiny little crumb of that pie of $2.4 trillion. And at its core, that's unjust. It's really about wealth redistribution and making sure that value is shared across the value chain. Again, this is not a radical idea. It's something that I think all of us as sort of morally driven people would agree is morally right. And it's this idea, again, lifting people out of poverty, giving people jobs, but not just, oh, these garment workers, they shouldn't complain because at least it's a job. It's about a job that's fulfilling. It's about an enriching job. It's about giving them aspiration. It's not just a job, but it's a job with equal pay, with fair pay, and it enriches their livelihood. Again, it's not much to ask for. It's the least a brand can do. This is number 3. So fashion gives people a voice, making it possible to speak up without fear, join together in unity without repression, and negotiate for better conditions at work and across communities. So this one's really all about the power of collective action. So a couple of stats here from Fashion Revolution that over 90% of workers in the global garment industry are unable to negotiate their wages or conditions. So that's only 10% of garment workers are able to unionize. And 80% of countries have violated the right to collective bargaining. So something that we see as a basic labor right, as a basic human right. Workers in the global garment industry are unable to achieve that right. Everyone in the fashion supply chain deserves this freedom of association and this unionization, because that in turn empowers them to make change in their own working lives. So this is a really, really important one. And again, it's another theme of Fashion Revolution this year, collective action and how important that really is. So this is number 4. Fashion respects culture and heritage. It fosters, celebrates, and rewards skills and craftsmanship. It recognizes creativity as its strongest asset. Fashion never appropriates without giving due credit or steals without permission. Fashion honors the artisan. So this one is a more holistic view of what ethical fashion means. sort of beyond just labor rights or materials. And it's really about cultural appropriation and copywriting. These are both unethical practices. So if we go back to this definition of ethical as meaning doing what's right, both appropriating from a marginalized culture and copying is unethical. So when we talk about cultural appropriation, what that means is when usually a Western brand or designer cherry picks design elements or styling elements from usually a marginalized culture, and they do this without permission, without crediting them, and more importantly, without paying them and involving them in that design process. It's without giving them a slice of that pie, of that profit. And copycatting really is about that violation of creative copyright. It's, you know, it can be fast fashion copying from luxury or luxury copying from an independent designer. But all of these practices, it really goes to the root of fashion refusing to honor the root of what it really is, which is creativity, which is expression, culture, and craft. And it's honoring that artisanal process. I would recommend here following Diet Prada on Instagram, who call out brands for both of these practices, cultural appropriation and copycatting, because they've sort of proved that that kind of call out culture and speaking up against brands you don't agree with does work, because if a brand gets called out on Diet Prada, they usually don't do very well on the internet, let's say. So that's a good one to follow. But yeah, I think this is really important to include here as a sort of more holistic view. So this one here, again, is on this similar theme of looking beyond just the kind of hot button issues of ethical fashion. So this one is: fashion stands for solidarity, inclusiveness, and democracy, regardless of race, class, gender, age, shape, or ability. It champions diversity as crucial for success. So this one is all about diversity and inclusivity. And it's important to note here that that's not just about the models. It's not just about models that you see on the catwalk or in campaigns. Although, side note, that is very important because we all know that representation leads to greater diversity down the line. But really, when it comes down to it, it's diversity in terms of the people in power, diversity in the decision makers, in the board members, in the designers. And it's also diversity in terms of who the brands are designing for. So if we keep on this system of a single type of designer designing for a single type of customer, we're never going to move beyond this paradigm that we're currently in. And again, this is such a huge issue, but it's important to note, you know, they've mentioned gender here, and that I often think of fast fashion as being a feminist issue because around like 80% of garment workers are women. So again, the fashion industry employs a huge number of women, but the majority of the time these are in the low paid, seen as low value roles, while those important kind of executive decision maker roles are men. If we don't have any diversity in the decision makers, how will the decisions impact the people who live in those diverse communities? So here we're going to move on slightly to the environmental side. So this is point number 6. Fashion conserves and restores the environment. It does not deplete precious resources, degrade our soil, pollute our air and water, or harm our health. Fashion protects the welfare of all living things and safeguards our diverse ecosystems. So I like the language in this one because it's not just about reducing our impact. It's not just about, you know, carbon offsetting or something. It's about regenerating and restoring the damage that has already been done. So it goes beyond that being carbon neutral. It really goes straight to the core of how can we, as a fashion industry, help restore the environment. So it also mentions soil and air and water. And this is because fashion's footprint really impacts upon every ecosystem, that there kind of isn't one that it doesn't touch. And I wanted to mention a few documentaries that dive deeper here. So River Blue is a really great documentary about fashion's impact on the world's rivers, which is maybe something you haven't thought about, but it's really quite shocking. I mean, there's a line in it that says, something along the lines of, you can tell the next hot color for the season by looking at the color of the water, because of all the toxic chemicals and dyes running off. The True Cost is a sort of classic documentary that kind of really covers every issue in this sphere. And then last year there was a documentary on BBC by Stacey Dooley, who highlighted a few of the issues that maybe aren't talked about in the mainstream so much. Like, for example, she traveled to the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan and highlighted the fact that this one of the world's greatest lakes has almost completely dried up due to irrigation for cotton. So really fashion's footprint extends on all of these ecosystems. It's a man-made product, but its impact on the natural world is so obvious. And again, the language here, they've highlighted that it's all living things. And to me, that makes me think too about animal welfare in this fashion utopia that we want to build, in this new normal. Do we want to exploit animals for fashion's gain? Do we want to use fur? Do we want to use exotic skins and leathers? Is this something that we as an industry want to carry on investing in? Or is this something, again, that needs to have a total system overhaul? So another one on the environment here, point number 7. Fashion never unnecessarily destroys or discards, but mindfully redesigns and recuperates in a circular way. Fashion is repaired, reused, recycled, and upcycled. Our wardrobes and landfills do not overflow with clothes that are coveted but not cherished, bought but not kept. So this is really about the end of life of a garment and sort of closing that loop. And it really made me think as well about this idea of, it says fashion never destroys. But right now, brands, this isn't even about us as consumers, but brands are destroying their stock in huge quantities. Think about that Burnberry scandal where Burberry burnt millions of pounds worth of luxury clothing. But it's not just on the luxury end. You know, there was Nike cutting out the ticks, the Just Do It ticks on their trainers so that they couldn't then be resold. So, and this comes down to the root of fashion existing on these trend cycles that are so quick, you know, 52 seasons a year, essentially. So it just becomes seen as disposable. And we've talked briefly in other workshops this week about what are brands going to do with all the stock that they're going to have left over when we come out of lockdown, because obviously we're not shopping. And are those collections just going to be seen as kind of not desirable to us as consumers because they're not on trend? Are they going to resort to destroying the stock, or will they find a way to use those materials and transform them into something else? Again, us as consumers, you know, we're not completely off the hook, because apparently every single year in the UK we send 300 million tons of clothing into landfill. And I think in our little ethical fashion bubble, we maybe think people don't actually throw their clothes in the bin, do they? But I mean, I've just seen in my bin and they do. This is really, I mean, the solution to this is really learning to love our clothes. Loved clothes last, learning to care for them properly, and also repairing, because as we know, repair has really become a bit of a revolutionary act. You know, it used to be very much just something you did historically, but now, I mean, people throw out a shirt that doesn't have a button because that skill of sewing on a button has been lost. Again, it's about closing the loop, recuperating in a circular way. So that introduces the idea of a circular economy, investing in kind of innovative new ways to have a piece of clothing go from cradle to cradle instead of cradle to grave. So instead of this system that we currently have, which is taking something from the earth, making something and then disposing of it, it's really about wearing that thing and then it somehow goes back into the system in a complete circle. And it goes beyond just recycling or sort of more simple concepts, but really designing from the start, designing in the circularity. Overall, I see this point as being about slowing fashion down, because we can talk for hours and hours about innovative new fabrics and things like that. But the root of the problem is that we make too much and we buy too much. Overproduction and overconsumption, That's the root of the problem. So moving on now to point number 8, fashion is transparent and accountable. Fashion embraces clarity and does not hide behind complexity, nor rely upon trade secrets to derive value. Anyone, anywhere can find out how, where, by whom, and under what conditions their clothing is made. So this one's about transparency, as we discussed earlier. That's sort of the root of the fashion revolution movement. Transparency being that vital first step to change. And really, anyone, anywhere should be able to find out this information. It should be so obvious and so accessible. We shouldn't have to read the small print on a tiny little label. We shouldn't have to click into different corporate social responsibilities on someone's website. It should be right there for us, because as consumers, most people don't want to have to go and seek out that information. We want it there. It's also often hidden behind sort of PR friendly headlines. So a brand might highlight one thing they're doing, but hide the rest. And that's what we call greenwashing, when a brand says, look at this amazing sustainable new collection, but then not divulging the information about the rest of their collections. Again, I really feel that legislation is key here, because brands sort of self-auditing themselves and disclosing what they choose to disclose, it's just never going to cut it. We really need an unbiased third party to be holding brands accountable, and sort of governments to step in and saying, this is what you have to disclose. Again, thinking about that food label, what a food brand needs to legally disclose. We need the same standards for fashion. So point number 9 here, this is a really important one. Fashion measures success by more than just sales and profits. Fashion conserves and restores the environment and values people over growth and profit. And I was thinking about this one in the Earth Logic workshop today, where we were thinking about, in the new normal, you know, how will we define success, like as businesses and as individuals? If it's not going to be profit, how do we define that? And it's really about this triple bottom line of people and planet, as well as just profit. So it's not about sacrificing profit, obviously, because brands need to make money, but it's about valuing them all equally. It's making a business model that works for everyone, not just the investors and the fat cats in the boardroom. It's about how can it work for all of us, including us as consumers and as wearers too. It's also about reporting. You know, brands need to produce financial reports and things like that for their investors. But could we create a system where brands have to report on their sustainability? You know, some brands do this by choice, but they're not forced to do that. Could we have a new regulation in place that forces brands to disclose their carbon impact, and it's audited by a third party? This is the sort of utopia that we need to make a reality. And again, it's really important during this coronavirus crisis that the headlines we see are not just focused on which brands are making sales and which ones aren't, and which ones are going into administration. It's really which brands are protecting their workers right now, which brands are prioritizing ethics right now. These are the sort of reports that we want to see in our imaginary future fashion industry too. So this is the very last slide now. This is a really poignant one, I think. So fashion lives to express, delight, reflect, protest, comfort, commiserate, and share. Fashion never subjugates, denigrates, degrades, marginalizes, or compromises. Fashion celebrates life. So I really love this one, because it kind of goes to the core of what fashion revolution is all about, which is that this is a movement of people that love fashion. It's not something we want to be banned. We don't want to boycott fashion. We don't want to ban everything. We love it. We want to celebrate it, but we just want it to be transformed. We just want it to be different. If we strip down fashion away from the kind of business side and away from the mass production side, it's an art, it's creativity, it's culture, it's craft, it's a way for us as individuals to express ourselves. And in that way, fashion is brilliant. I love fashion. It's not that much to ask to say, can I have this without exploitation? And for me, the industry that I really want to see emerge after this crisis is when an industry where we go back to the root of what fashion really is, you know, an industry that honors the joy that fashion brings to people's lives. So that's been the points of the manifesto. And I just wanted to note as well that you can sign this manifesto. It's live on the website and it has been for a while. And this is basically your opportunity to say, yes, I agree with these points, or maybe I don't agree, maybe there's something I want to add, but it's sort of telling the world this is the fashion industry we want to build. You can also look out for the transparency index, which I've mentioned, and also the fashion revolution white paper. So these are all, you know, if you take a look at the website, you'll see all these documents and ways that you can sign and use your voice as well. So I'm just going to stop showing, actually, I'm going to stop showing my screen for just a wee bit. How do I do this? Just to see, yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them now. You can unmute yourself or you can pop them in the chat. I've sort of sped through that a little bit because I know that we're all have a lot to take in this week, but it's something that I felt was really important to share right now. Any questions? If not, I'll just, oh, we've got one here. So Mary says, what do you think needs to happen for this manifesto to be achieved? I think for me, it's really about going beyond individual brands. So there are a lot of individual brands doing amazing things, as we all know. You know, it's amazing to celebrate the sustainable brands, but it's not going to cut it when there's just a few people in sort of separate silos doing amazing things. We need to come together. So I think collective action is the way that this is going to be achieved. So Margarita says, what's the best business model for the fashion industry? Circular economy. Circular economy is certainly a direction that we should all be moving to. There's obviously a lot of different business models that brands are exploring right now, like rental and like peer-to-peer sharing and things like along those lines. But yeah, circular economy is definitely where we should all be heading, because I mean, there's finite resources on the earth and there's finite space in landfills. So we really can't keep going on like this. I'm just going to share the screen again so that you can see my last slide. If anyone has any questions that they maybe think of later, you can also get in contact with me. So I've put here where to find Fashion Revolution Scotland and where to find me, and you can also pop me an email and things like that. Oh, I've just seen some other chat questions. Sorry, it was hidden from my view. Are there any more seminars in coming days from you guys? Yes, we have lots going on. It's been quite a crazy week for us, but we've got a few tomorrow. We've got a workshop on craftivism. We've got a workshop on tracing your wardrobe through creating a tech necklace, which is really cool. And we've also got things on our Instagram, such as mending tutorials, and an amazing workshop from Nikki, who's our country coordinator, about deconstructing fast fashion, both literally with an unpicker and through discussion. And Mary, who's in the chat here, is also presenting her research on sustainable fashion in Scotland, which is going to be really interesting. But if you want to look at the timetable, we've got it up on our Facebook at the moment, and on our Instagram you'll see lots of stories and things like that. I'm just going to do these questions as well. So Zara says, what do you think is the best angle to raise this conversation with people who don't feel anything needs to change in fashion? That's a really interesting point. It's obviously quite hard to have these sorts of conversations with people who kind of don't understand the magnitude, and something that I always get a counter argument, if you could even have one, is, oh, but at least people have jobs. And surely if I stop buying fast fashion, I'm putting people out of a job. That's something that really gets me, because it really takes away the humanity of the people making our clothes. It's sort of like, do you just see them as hands to make your clothing? Like, do you not see that they're humans who need to be paid and to have fulfilling lives? So I really think the best angle, if you want to raise this conversation, is to kind of use that empathy. And obviously with coronavirus, I think we're all kind of maybe reconnecting with that idea a little bit about, you know, the people that work in supermarkets and the people that work in hospitals. You know, we're maybe as a community, at least here, like in the West, are saying, hang on a sec, maybe I should be grateful for these people. Maybe you can connect with your friends or family by kind of connecting on that human level about this question of who made my clothes. Is really, it's not just what factory made my clothes, it's who is the person that made my clothes, what does their life look like, you know, how is their work impacting them as a person and their family. So I think that's maybe an angle to tackle. I'm just going to have a glass of water. There's another question from Simon saying, how do you think that collective action can be generated? Do you think the new normal will create the conditions for a more collaborative industry? How do I think that collective action can be generated? I'm not sure if you're talking about like collective action in terms of sort of like collective bargaining and unionization, or just more how do we as a collective kind of raise up. But I think collective action can be generated through campaigns like Fashion Revolution Week. I think it's really obvious in weeks like this, just the sheer power of people coming together. And I hope that that momentum can carry throughout the year, because it's not just 1 week in April that these problems exist. And do I think the new normal will create the conditions? I hope so. I really do. I think it's given us all a little bit of time to reflect. And hopefully that reflection will lead us to solutions. A lot of people are working really, really hard on these exact issues. I hope that it will create the conditions. And as I mentioned before, I hope that we can foster more of a sense of empathy for the people making our clothes. Am I confident, Mark says, am I confident the manifesto is inclusive enough in regards to changing the behavior of consumers? I would say that they have focused on the wearer as well as just the workers and things like that throughout the supply chain. There does need to be overall in the sustainable fashion movement more of a focus on consumers, and people like Lynn Wilson and her research have been doing a lot in terms of what does the consumer want from fashion, and not just the ethical fashion consumer like me, but what does your average shopper need from fashion? So perhaps this manifesto could go further in connecting with consumers, and not just this manifesto, but the whole movement, you know, Fashion Revolution and the ethical fashion movement, to connect with our friends and our family and people that aren't in this industry. Yeah, I definitely think it could go further. Thanks for sharing that link, Mary. That is where you can find all our events. And Lynn Blake says, do you feel the industry should return to each of our homelands as a good place to start in creating regulations? That's a really interesting point. And that's again something that they talked about in this Earth Logic workshop about localization, and how localization isn't about being really insular and nationalist or something, but it's about getting kind of rooting down in our communities. And within fashion, that could be potentially a really powerful force in allocating resources to what works best for that homeland, as you say. In terms of creating regulations, again, potentially yes, because obviously it's almost impossible to create really international guidelines for these things. And brands often dodge responsibility by saying, oh, it's not our fault because Bangladesh has lax labor laws and things like that. So it's really about, in terms of lawmakers, I don't know the ins and outs of this because I'm not a lawyer, but it's like, how can we hold brands accountable both in their country that they are based in and in the countries they operate in? So localization could be a really powerful force for that, and something that very much might come into play in this new normal because of restrictions on travel and shipping and things like that. I hope that answers your question. Okay, it's quite a big one. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to shout out now. And if not, I'm just going to stop sharing. That's all right. Oh, we've got another great question. Yeah, about the Fashion Revolution Transparency Index and H&M coming out at the top. So Cynthia says, I'm a manufacturer and I understand the supply chain and how it works. I feel the social and environmental policies and commitments have provided a loophole for brands. Not enough accountability, and implementation. I completely agree, Cynthia, and there's a lot of conversation around this going on about the sort of confusion of H&M coming out on top of the transparency index. And that, again, it goes back to maybe what Mark said about consumers, in that consumers are confused about the language, about what transparency means. If you see, oh, Fashion Revolution's put something out and H&M's at the top, great, H&M sustainable. Really, as you mentioned, they've put out kind of commitments and policies, but they're not actually implementing them. And that comes back to this idea of them self-auditing. You know, there's no third party, there's no international regulation. Certain countries have made steps against that. I think it was Sweden or another Scandi country that stopped H&M from putting out a campaign because they were greenwashing, but really it needs to be in international collaboration. So yeah, I completely agree that these sort of commitments and pledges, and whenever I get sent a press release that's like, look at these brands making a pledge, I'm like, yeah, but who's going to follow up on this? You know, there's a lot of these pledges that say, oh, we're doing this by 2050. And you're like, is someone going to come back to you in 2050 and check on this? Because I feel like they're not. So I completely agree with you there. And yes, I think there is some more work that Fashion Revolution and all of us need to do in educating consumers that that transparency index is not the be all and end all. It doesn't mean they're sustainable. It just means they've made more commitments. She's come back with the social and environmental policies and commitments make up about 55% of the index. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's really good to criticize their methodology as well. There was quite an interesting conversation about this on Aja Barber's Instagram, if you're interested, where she talks about the kind of pitfalls of that transparency index too. Would it be possible to find recordings? We are recording most of the sessions, so yes, we're going to put them out hopefully. And this one has been streamed on Facebook too, and a few others have. So you can watch that on Facebook, it's sort of there. So we'll happily share the links to those too. Could you please tell me the Instagram account? I'm not sure if you mean... oh yeah, Aja Barber, and also one I recommended earlier, I don't know if you mean that, is Diet Prada. Yes, thanks Haley. Yeah, any more questions? I'm sort of wrapping up because there's another event on this Zoom at 7:30, I think. Yeah, 7:30 from a local brand called Beira on new disruptive business models, which will be really interesting. But yeah, thank you so much. If there's any more questions, please feel free to email me. My email is info@ruthmacgilp.com, or you can just DM me on Instagram at Ruth MacGilp blog, or you can DM the Fashion Revolution Scotland team. We're all online all this week, so we'd really like to hear from you, and we'd like you to get involved in our campaign as well. But if that's everything, I just want to thank you all for giving up your evening to me, and apologize for my like shiny appearance as well. This is not very flattering lighting. Getting used to this whole Zoom thing. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and if anyone wants the slides as well, maybe just drop your email address in this chat and I can send them to you as well. But if not, you can find the manifesto in full on the Fashion Revolution website if you just go to fashionrevolution.org/manifesto. So that's that. But yeah, feel free to unmute yourselves to say goodbye or anything like that, and I'll just be here and wait for you all to drop off.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Was informative.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care. Have a good evening.
This
Bye.
is the bit, isn't it? It's like... All right, I'm going to stop.
Well, thanks so much, Ruth.
It was really wonderful that you took us through the whole manifesto, because it raises such a lot of important, very eloquently put points. And I think it's a fantastic resource for brands and designers who they feel really strongly about ethics and sustainability for their brand, but it's quite hard to put it into words. And so the Fashion Revolution team have spent a big team of people who've written lots of books and articles about all sorts of things. We sat down and they really tried to express how we all feel about it from all the angles. And of course, it's really inspiring for people who are out there buying from brands to see that this is really how they feel. And yeah, so thanks so much for that, Ruth.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really amazing document, and I always come back to it because, yeah, I mean, the language they use, I think, does like it really careful to include all the issues. It's quite hard for an individual to think about all of those issues, but yeah, I agree.
Absolutely. I think it must have been a lot of work to put it together.
I know. I know. I always think about that. But yeah, I'm gonna end the meeting now because I think I'm not sure if someone else is using it. So, but thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Ruth.